My next guest is a combat sports journalist, and his work has been featured in many publications all over the world. Currently, he writes for MuayThai.com, Beyond Kickboxing, MMA Sucka, and he is also the co founder of the highly popular Instagram handle, Calf Kick Sports. He joins me here today, Mr. Timothy Wheaton. Mr. Wheaton, thank you for being here. It's a true honor. I've been looking forward to having you on for a very, very long time.
Man, Mr. Mom's Basement MMA, the honor is all mine. Thank you for hosting this. I love the idea, and I'm flattered that you thought of me. But seriously, thank you. The honor is all mine, sir.
Well, I wanted to just simply say that the relationship you and I have, this space is crazy. You got your own thing going on, like you're running at 10 million miles an hour. I got my own thing going on. And I feel like our relationship has been very akin to like Home Improvement, where you're Wilson and I'm Tim Allen, and we kind of peep at each other and jab
Yeah.
across the fence for a little bit, and then we kind of go our own separate ways. So with in recognition of that, there are a lot of things that I just don't know about you personally. So I wanted to ask, you sound a lot like me. You don't sound like a UK guy. And I know that once upon a time, you were probably within driving distance to me. So I have to ask, how does a Canadian guy end up in the UK covering mixed martial arts?
Okay, it's a. I'll give you the full story, and I won't hold anything back. So this is the 100% true because this show is meant for like other people getting into this space and like learning about it. So I'll give you the full version that I often don't give to other people. But I lived in Calgary, and my wife and I there. I was a financial planner before. I worked in banking. It was a good little money making industry there, especially in Calgary. We got the opportunity to move overseas to the UK. Fantastic. We wanted better connections to Europe because our biggest hobby was traveling and going around the world. From the UK, you can travel to Europe quite easy. So we moved. No problem there. We moved in the middle of COVID. So no one's hiring during COVID. I figured I could maybe get a banking job in the UK. Everyone was like, nah, there's no way. So, okay, I talked to supermarkets and they were like, nope, you can't stock shelves here. I talked to stores and restaurants and they're like, yeah, we're not running and you're not allowed to. Moving, it was very hard. And I don't think I worked for like 6 to 8 months. Like nothing was open, nothing was available, but everything I applied to, they said no. But I was watching at the time a ton of fighting. Like I would stay up and watch Ryzen, and then I'd watch one championship in the afternoon, and then you'd have KSW and Cage Warriors, and then I'd stay up late and watch the UFC. And that was just my hobby. And I thought, man, I should get paid for this. Someone might as well pay me. If I'm going to watch all this, someone might as well pay me for it. So I spoke to a website, and then they said, you have no experience. Have you ever written? And I was like, in university. Yeah, I used to write essays. And they're like, yeah, no, you don't have no writing experience. So here's the tricky part. I went and bought my own .com. And then I would write for my own .com as the editor. And then I would go back to the website and be like, oh, I've been writing for this website over here. And they're like, oh, perfect. You have experience now. Come on in. And that was kind of my foot in the door. But that's how I started in this industry.
That is just completely wild. And it just goes to show you that there are multiple paths to getting into this space. And which begets another question. Calf Kick Sports, like that, I've watched you grow that account. It's immensely popular now. I know that you and Ash run it, but I wanted to ask, like, how does that figure into the story? Because you've been very active on that, and I wanted to clarify because I did a shitty job in my introduction. It's not just an Instagram handle. Like you guys are actually interviewing talent. You have kickboxers on there all the time. You have regional talent, UFC fighters on there all the time. So like that's also happening in parallel to your writing career.
Yeah, so working with Ash on Calf Kick Sports, Ash is absolutely tremendous. One of the best working partners I've ever had in the industry, and I'm so lucky to have been working with Ash. And honestly, Calf Kick Sports, like founding it and the setup and the way that we do things, and like some of the stuff that's gone viral has all been Ash. Like, like I see myself as just like I've hitched myself to working with Ash, and I'm very lucky to be working with him. Even some of our bigger interviews. I think most of the really big interviews were all booked through him, and like Ash is absolutely awesome. But yeah, he was a meme page. He was an MMA meme page, and he messaged my professional account, which at the time was Calf Kick Sports, and he was like, "Hey, should we like start interviewing fighters and just see where this goes?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then like I changed my name to Tim Wheaton MMA, and then we made a new Calf Kick Sports page. And then we just kind of built it, and now we got lots of followers on YouTube and Instagram, and it's just worked out tremendously well. But honestly, that page, the success comes from, I think we didn't take it too seriously, because we put like good stuff, professional stuff. We put memes on it. We message tons of fighters to try to get interviews, and like we get 1% of the interview requests we want. You know what I mean? But yeah, it's just been putting in a little bit of work every day has really made that page successful. And then I've been able to transition that success to other websites, because websites I speak to, I can say I've been doing calf kick sports. I can run your Instagram as well. So like, aside from a lot of the writing I do, there's like behind the scenes Instagrams that I run because of the success with calf kick sports. But yeah, no, Ash gets all the credit on that one. He's an awesome guy.
This whole media, the MMA media space is so heavily dependent on having a really robust social media presence. And one of the things that I think you guys do really well is you put out really engaging content. There's like a really engaged community. Anytime you guys post up something, there's a lot of like interaction. And so I kind of want to
Yeah,
like peel back the
fair said.
onion a little bit and ask, like, 99% of the time, if there's a newcomer who's looking to break into this industry, they're going to create an Instagram account. They're going to start building up that social media presence. And take me back to like the early days of calf kick sports, like, and with your familiarity with how Instagram works, like, and on top of like, more importantly, your knowledge of this industry, can you get like give me like your top three do's and top three don'ts when you're first getting started and trying to build up on social media?
Man, listen, I have no fucking clue what works on social media. And anyone who is confident and will sit here and be like, I'm a social media expert, tell a person to shut their mouth, because they don't know either. Then no one knows what they're doing on social media. All of us are just firing stuff and seeing what sticks. Sometimes we'll do 6 posts in one day and half of them are great. Sometimes you do 1 post a day and it's amazing. Like, none of this makes sense. There's no patterns, there's no recognitions. Also, shout out to James Lynch, who was a massive help. He gave me a lot of advice early on. He has a video of like, if you're starting out in MMA, do these 5 things. And that was great. I just want to make sure we cover James Lynch before I move forward. Okay, so with what ticks on social media, I'm not sure, because I actually run more than one account, and they all have different follower accounts. Some of them are more than 25,000 followers. Some of them are about 10,000, and some of them are about 2,000. And the interactions just don't make sense. You know what I mean? It just doesn't add up. Like I put a lot of stuff on TikTok, and I can confidently say like I kind of get what's going on TikTok a lot more than what I get on Instagram. So I would say Twitter, make a Twitter and communicate with other professionals in that industry, other people who are in the media. Talk to them, actively speak with them, interact with them. Don't interact with like a lot of the MMA Twitter garbage. On Instagram, you need to be doing at least daily posting, share with other people and their pages and stuff like that. Do story for story exchanges. Just do what you need to do to get followers and make it look serious. Mix photos and reels, I think, is working right now. But like, I might give you this advice today, and in 6 months they change what Instagram even is.
Right,
Like,
exactly.
man, remember we used to do shopping on Instagram? Like, reels didn't even exist when you and I started. They had IGTV, which nobody watched. Like, what's working today may not work tomorrow. But yeah, the top 3 do's: mix what you're posting, do at least daily, share with other people. The top 3 don'ts: don't take time off. That is the biggest killer. All of your momentum, Instagram kills you. If you take a week off, Instagram doesn't let you build that back up, even if you do daily posting after that. And that sucks. So if you're going away for a while, just get someone else to post on
Mm-hmm.
it. Don't post the same stuff over and over again. Mix your content, and
Don't lift content from people without letting people know where it came from. I think that's a big one.
no, fuck it. Steal your content. Who gives a shit? No, actually, no, that's a good one. Do make original content. Do your best. Canva is so easy to use, and they have templates set up already. Just grab a quote from an interview that you've done, put it up there, bam, original content, and people think you're an expert and you're very good at this. Instagram, I think, don't take Instagram too easy. Of like, you might do 5 posts and they all do poorly. That's fine. The 6th post will click. Just keep pushing. Don't take it seriously. If one post fails, just keep going, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's my advice. And I'm running like 5 Instagram pages and I don't even understand this.
No, you're absolutely right. But it just goes to show, like, if you're just starting out, you're in explore mode, and it's okay. Like, everything that you post up, as long as you're doing it, I think that's what's important, because certain things catch,
Yep.
certain things don't. And there have been things that I've put out that I personally feel like they're gold and they're completely ignored. And then I'll put out something where I'm just kind of like, whatever. And then it just runs wild. It's a wildfire. So I would tell anybody, like, just remove your thoughts about what your content is, good or bad. Take that out of the equation, throw it out there, and let the people decide. I think you'll be surprised sometimes. Tim, I wanted to kind of shift a little bit and talk a little more about you specifically.
Okay.
A day in the life of like what an MMA journalist looks like, because when you're not covering an event versus when you're covering an event, I feel are two very different things. And I would like for you to kind of give people a behind the scenes look of like what a typical week looks like for an event that you are covering. There's so much about this space that people don't understand and don't see. The only thing they see is the content that we post, but they don't see the preparation, they don't see the research and all the other things I know that you have to do. I was hoping you can kind of like walk me through what a typical day looks like for an event that you're covering either remotely or in person.
So yeah, I am an MMA full timer, so everything I do goes into this. Uh, if I'm doing an event, it's going to be usually on the weekend. Usually, it's going to be some kickboxing out in the Netherlands. That's just this is what I do. I've covered the UFC. I've covered Bellator and stuff like that. There are different intensities in terms of how much. Like a Glory and a Bellator is essentially just one day, whereas the UFC is all week long. So most people want to cover the UFC, so I'll tell you about what that was like. But UFC Monday, Tuesday, you're going to be prepping because everyone on that card, you're going to be interviewing before the show and after the show through the press conference. So make sure you have some questions lined up there. And then Wednesday, you'll probably head down for the press conference. Thursday, you're doing nothing. Friday is the weigh-ins and post-weigh-in show, and they have a big bunch of stuff there. Saturday is the event, so you're just in the back room. You at a UFC show, you're not watching any of it. You have a TV set up in a back room, and you can watch it, but you don't have time because you're interviewing so many people. There's constantly fighters, and if they don't have any fighters, they'll go grab one. They'll just find some fighter who is attending today, and you get to interview him. And along with that, the skills that you need to have, it's not just prep. It's your cameras are charged. You need 2 SD cards. One is rendering in your computer while the other one is filming. And you have 2 batteries. One's always charging, one's always in the camera. So you're filming and you're rendering at the same time and you're uploading. So all of your footage needs to be like, you need to be paying attention to what people are saying so you can ask them questions while you're also filming, while you're making sure that your microphones are okay. It's not, you do need some pretty good equipment to film a lot of this stuff because otherwise media companies won't want you to go because you're filming garbage, right? You're filming off your phone or something like that. So I use a Canon camera. I got a Rode microphone that plugs into it. So you do need to buy fairly good gear. And then you need to speak to media companies to say, hey, I can attend this event. Will you send me to this event? And then, yeah, if the company says, yeah, well, you can go to this event under our credentials, but we're not going to pay you. You say, okay, great. I'm not going to film anything. And then if they're fine, I don't care. I'm not getting paid. I'm just attending the event for free. And that's a cool benefit. You know, you and I have both seen free events and didn't do any work there. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
But if someone's paying you a lot of money, you do need to turn out some results. But yeah, it is a ton of work. I think covering the UFC for the week was one of the most exhausting things I've ever done in my life because you're getting up at 7 to attend 8 a.m. And then you have a press conference for 8 hours and it's just like a normal job. And then you're rendering videos all evening. The press, the weigh-ins, again, it's like a first thing in the morning, talking to people. And then the evening, you're still rendering videos and talking to people because they have more events. And then the event itself is another full 10-hour day where you're filming. Like I was still uploading videos at 2:30 in the morning just because like I didn't have time. And the UFC asked us to leave at that point. And then you're using like a Wi-Fi in the arena and stuff like that. But it can be a tremendous amount of work. But most people after a UFC event will take the Monday off just because it's so intense. Yeah, that's that.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot, and thank you for that because like I feel there's some misconceptions about it where it's like you show up, you ask a couple questions, and you're drinking beers with Conor McGregor. And like I don't think it really works that way, guys. Like there's a lot more that goes into it. Me personally, I don't like covering live events. That's just not something that really like calls to me. If I'm gonna go to an event, I just want to watch it as a civilian. I don't want to have a camera. I personally don't want to work. I much prefer a more intimate setting, like where it's a podcasting setting. But that's enough about me. That's just a very Tyler
But
centric thing.
but I agree with you. If you want to watch an event, being a media member is maybe the lamest way to do it because you are not watching it. You have to be on your computer. You're rendering videos, you're uploading, you're constantly typing descriptions. Like the UFC events I've covered, I didn't watch any second of. All of it, I was in the back room. You know what I mean? And yeah, like Conor McGregor and beer weren't there, but man, they serve you breakfast. There are some benefits of like you get free dinner.
Right.
Like they have to because you're there 8 hours. But yeah, no, it is a lot of work. But no, like a lot of guys, especially on smaller shows, like go for the weigh-ins and press conference. And then for the live event, you can go home. Like you've got your quotes, you got your interviews. You don't have to cover the event if you don't want the post-fight presser. A lot of guys just say, like, go to the pre-fight presser, weigh-ins, go home. It's funner to watch an event from your couch anyway.
Yeah, that's very true. For people that are looking to get into it,
Mm.
I'll throw out this qualifier. I think it's really important. When you and I first started, when we linked up in 2021, the
Yeah.
media space looked very, very different compared to what it looks like now. And I feel like there are a lot of other people that were in our cohort of like accounts that were being pushed up at that time. And I look around and it's like I'm still standing, you and Ash are still standing, everyone else is gone. They've either left the industry entirely. In some cases, other people have just kind of like moved on to other things, like they've got with other outlets or whatnot, and that's great. But a lot of these people, I'd say the attrition rate is so high. Why is that, in your opinion?
I think it's because stuff just it is so exhausting to have things that you've worked very hard on and it doesn't click. It just doesn't go through for whatever reason. No one's clicking on your links. No one's watching your long videos. No one's looking at your images. I think it can be exhausting week over week to not have success, but I think that's a part of it. And you have to push through and keep going. I think if you're getting started in this industry, know what success looks like and know what you want to be. If you want to be an influencer page on Instagram, cool. What does that success look like? Or like what I've described, the Instagram pages are promoting me essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that success look like in my career? And that means, does that mean attending events? Does that mean working full time? If you want to be a writer, what does success look like? Is it full time pay or is it respect? Like they're not always the same, but what does success always look like? And I think a lot of people just go into this being like, I'm going to make a page and people are going to flock to it. No one's going to look. No one cares. There's so many Instagram MMA pages at this point. And I'm not sure that MMA is not even as big as it was in 2021, in all honesty, of like, what the Conor McGregor numbers were like when you were in it compared to now.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like sometimes the sport overall isn't as big as it was. And it sucks to say, but like just keep pushing. But I think you also need to know what success looks like. Because if you say, I want X amount of followers in X amount of months and you don't accomplish it, do you adjust something or do you just quit? It's perfectly okay to say I didn't make it in this space or anything like that,
Mm-hmm.
and I had fun doing it. But yeah, I guess the only advice I would have is just keep going. Yeah,
Yeah, and I would also qualify it by saying, for me anyway, and this is just my answer. I guess it just depends on like, from what your perspective is and what your goals are and how you want
yeah.
to put your thumbprint on the space. But for me, my Instagram,
Mm.
I've never really, I just hit 3,000 followers. Just
So
hit it.
good,
And that's
so
like,
good.
that's like for me, I've always looked at that though. And like, okay, that's cool. That just shows me 3,000 people are interested in my content. And that's great.
Yeah,
And that's great. But I always put out this caution. It doesn't matter if you have 1,000 followers, 5,000, or 100,000. Like your content has to be good. And like if you're focused in on just like, stuffing your numbers, all of it is meaningless unless if your content is garbage. So I always tell people like, hey, that's great. You got a lot of followers, or don't worry if you don't have a lot of followers. I don't have a lot of followers. Put out good content. If you put out good content, all your other bases are covered. I feel like people don't always do that, however. Running this podcast is a ton of work. That's why I like to unwind. I like to have a couple beers. I like to have a glass of wine or two every once in a while. It doesn't take much of it to make me feel like trash the next day. headaches, upset stomach. We've all been there. It's the worst. Your weekend is completely ruined. That is why my go to is pregame. It is a revolutionary elixir from my friends at Vitali Boost. One scoop with a glass of water before you indulge and another before you go to bed is the only investment you need to make to be on track for a productive next day. It's not just for drinkers. Fighters love it too. After hitting the scales, I know what you do. You go and you grab a sports drink or you grab something else to get you the electrolytes that you need. I personally know some fighters who use this as their go to coming off the scales because they want the electrolytes without the sugar, the artificial flavors, or any of the other garbage that you'll find in other products. Go to vitaliboost.com and use my code basement at checkout to let them know that I sent you. You'll get a discount for your trouble. You've got nothing to lose. It's a 60-day money back guarantee, and we ship this stuff worldwide. Check it out. The link for this is in the description. I know you're going to love it.
Yeah, that's something, and it's very hard, like, know what you want out of this industry, because it can be exhausting to put out content that you're quite proud of and no one looks at it. Right. And I'll admit that a lot of my very good articles that I'm proud of, no one read those. I know no one read those. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So it's one of those mental hurdles of like, I'm putting out good content. No one's looking at it. You need to be able to push through, and that's okay because you're making content that you personally are proud of. If you put out a meme page and stole a bunch of memes and no one likes it, that's fine. Mm-hmm. You didn't make that. But if you're putting your heart on the line, know that you put out good content. And another thing I'll also mention, if you get a bunch of followers, like you said, it doesn't matter if you have 3,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 or 25,000 followers. Advertisers are only looking at content interactions anyway. None of the follower counts can be faked. Like, no, everyone knows that. So if you're trying to sell space on an Instagram page, it is only based on content interactions. So content interactions is the more important part. But yeah, like you said, put out content that you are highly proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely critical. I also want to talk a little bit about some do's and don'ts of this industry. I have gotten in so much shit starting off because I didn't understand how a lot of these things work. There are like some unwritten rules in this whole MMA space for media, and I want to just like pull back the cloak a little bit and maybe share some of the hard lessons that I have learned, and then maybe you can as well.
You start us off,
and I will go ahead. I'll start this off. For me, especially when I only had like a couple hundred followers, I didn't realize how much people really pay attention. Like, you don't think they do. You think that, you're just speaking to a room full of friends, you're hashtagging, you're just getting started, and you don't really think about like the long-term implications of anything that you're putting out there.
I know.
One time I interviewed a fighter for a regional card, and this fighter didn't get on the main card, and that was a big deal because that meant he was going to get exposure to the UFC Fight Pass market. Of course. Something happened, and I won't get into all the details as to like why they elected to put him on the undercard. Ticket sales, sorry. Oh my god. but in any event, I saw that he was a talented fighter, and I was just like, this is bullshit. So I wrote up like a little hit piece, a little mini hit piece, basically saying like, hey, such and such promotion. That's whack that you guys aren't putting him on the main card. WTF? Would you believe it that 6 hours later I got a DM from that promotion saying like, basically, talking to me kind of sternly, like, you don't know what you're talking about. This is kind of how it works. Think maybe a little bit more before you speak and put our name out there. Yeah, things are cool now, but it took like 2 years to bridge that relationship. And I wanted to say that like that was a foot in mouth moment for me. I probably shouldn't have done that. I learned a valuable lesson. That's my most embarrassing story. Think a little bit more about what it is you're putting out there, and don't assume people aren't going to see your content, because they will, even if you don't have a lot of followers.
You're 100% correct. There have been, you and I are not big in this industry by any means. And like I've had to pull podcast segments. I've had to pull, there's multiple articles that I've had to pull or edit because of different organizations have reached out to websites to get stuff removed. There's entire interviews that are just sitting around. But yeah, it really, anytime that you have a voice in a, the thing is that MMA people maybe don't realize this of how niche we are, especially when you are not covering the UFC. If you are covering any of this other stuff in that space, it's a very niche thing that you're covering. Because you have to imagine, like, imagine you only covered like German fencing or something like that. You'd be like, that's a tiny industry. Probably the same size as regional MMA. So if you are one of those people in that space and calling out someone in German fencing, they're going to hear about it. You do have a voice. But yeah, getting your content pulled is just part of the game. And this is one of the really big problems that we've had in MMA because there's very few to no independent journalists because our websites constantly get threatened from multiple organizations. And I won't name any, but people are going to ask, like, even the Big Show. I'm like, yeah, even the Big Show. Even the Big Show has asked us to pull content because of things that we said. Which is to say, like, there's not a lot of independent journalists anymore because even the big website that was doing independent media back in the day, which was SureDog, they had their credentials pulled and they were blacklisted and stuff. They played nice now. So a lot of these independent journalists don't really exist. Bloody Elbow was for a while, and I think they still are. But what the future of Bloody Elbow is, we don't really know because they got their funding pulled.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think, yeah, I always thought the sport was like way bigger until I started writing about it. And you get like a CEO message you one day because of something you said. And you're like, man, the sport's so small. Like I did like a 25-minute segment on a podcast about this one guy that I really didn't like. And after the show, I just removed it because it's such a small industry. He absolutely will hear about it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So I eventually did change my policy to, rather than be like a really hard-headed, opinionated guy, it's just gonna be all positive and let's just see where it goes.
Mm-hmm.
So I did change my angle at one point. So rather than like, I don't know, rather than trying to be like a really intense talking head, just be all positive and see where it goes, essentially. Yeah. But it happens all the time. In fact, you know what? I'll also admit that that is extremely validating for journalists when you have $1 billion corporation or $1 million corporation coming to you and saying that you said something that affected us. You struck a nerve. You're like, oh, that just, that is delicious. Oh, I didn't think anyone read what I said, but you guys are saying here that it affects your bottom line. That's lovely. I must have said something that was true and accurate.
Absolutely. And Tim, that's one of the themes that I followed. So for me, my approach is I have taken positive and negative. I've removed both of those feelings. And when I'm like, especially this comes out way more when I'm writing, or it's like, no, like if you got like violently knocked out, I'm going to write Tim got violently knocked out. And, like that's exactly what I'm going to write. Like what I see is what I see, and it doesn't matter who it is, if it's somebody I like, if it's somebody I don't like my job to me when I'm covering an event is I report what the news is and I remove my personal feelings from it. And the facts are going to be what they're going to be. But my job isn't to spin a story one way or the other. It's just to simply tell you what happened, what the news is. I wouldn't necessarily take that approach in an actual podcasting format, but if when I write, it's a little different.
This is the thing, and you're 100% correct. Absolutely. What we write is actually, I think, more important. We can be quite snarky on podcasts, like no one, people barely listen. But right. On writing, someone gave me advice, and like, if you didn't want that fighter's mother reading, don't write it down because you can be quite rude and quite snarky, and if that stuff on the internet never goes away.
Right.
So yeah, I'd say on a podcast you can be quite hard hitting.
Yeah. Absolutely, because we have the ability to inflect. Sometimes sarcasm comes out, and anybody with any like remote amount of like emotional intelligence can pick up on that. Writing is very different. You don't have that nuance.
Yeah. I think I did one kind of negative piece, and I still get comments on it. But the way that I see it is that I'm listing, like you said, I'm just listing facts. To reassess the art, to just like reframe an argument. So I still think I'm right, but I do recognize that maybe that entire piece didn't have to be written in that way. Yeah, sure. That was maybe a bit more negative than I needed it to be. And it's still online, but I don't send it to potential like hires, like people who, I don't send it as a sample of my work anymore. Uh, but yeah, Anyway, yeah, it's a weird space we work in. I would say keep it positive always, especially if you're starting out.
Here is a interesting one, and I get asked this question, and I'd love to hear your answer. It's kind of taboo. We don't really talk about it too much in the industry, and it's Tyler, how do you book guests? So there's a lot of things that go behind it that people don't necessarily know about. And I get asked this question from time to time. I'm happy to share how I do it, but I'd love to
Go ahead.
ask you, Tim. So, like for you, um, like what is the approach that you use? Like, are there some do's and don'ts to like how you book talent? When you're going to interview them for writing pieces, it's a little bit different. Sometimes we don't always interact with those fighters, but let's just assume you're going to ask a guest to come on to Calf Kick Sports. Can you tell me a little bit about what's the approach that you have used and where have you found the most success in doing so?
The most success I've had is through Instagram DMs. Like there's no secret, there's nothing sexy about it.
Mhm.
It's just messaging fighters and saying, "Hey, do you want to do an interview on this show?" That's it. And like I said, we probably got 1% of the fighters that we want on just because most go in the garbage, and that's fine.
Mhm.
Another way that a piece of advice that I want to give to everyone is that if you're able to put your foot in the door, keep going. With every company I've worked with, I've told them like, "Oh, you want me to write? Cool. I can do social media. I can do video. I can do interviews. I can do podcasts. Whatever you need me to do, I can do that." So always try to give as much as you can when people are offering you money, and have the same attitude when you're working with companies. If they are not, again, if they're not the UFC, organizations actually really do want to work with you, because we had um, every MMA organization that I've spoken with, whether it's their PR department or someone else in their industry, I'll say the same thing of like, I want to cover your event live, and I want to cover it like it's the Super Bowl. So
Mhm.
set up an interview with every fighter on the card with me. And they're always excited because they want that kind of coverage. They actually do want that. And you're doing them a favor by talking to all of their fighters. So if you, so the two main ways: do DMs on Instagram, which Ash is absolutely killer on. He's the best at that. And speak directly with PRs of organizations. Like you can go on LinkedIn and find the PR head of almost any MMA organization and just say like, "Hey, 2 weeks from now, this guy's fighting for a title. Can I interview him?" 100% they're going to say yes. That happens all the time. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think that's really, really important. I wanted to throw out this kind of disclaimer too. And these are just rules of thumb. These aren't like definites. These aren't like written in stone because nothing is in this
Mm-hmm.
industry. Things are way too malleable, and there is that element of chance. But I'll just say this, for example, if you are, Tim Wheaton MMA.com and
Yeah.
you are brand new into this space, Robert Whitaker's fighting, and if you think you're going to DM Robert Whitaker and get him on your show, that's probably not going to work. So I would tell anybody, understand these people get hundreds of DMs every single day, and 90% of them they don't read. They can't.
Yeah.
It's not possible. If you want to book somebody like that, there are two things that you generally need. Generally, you either need to have a credential with the UFC in the Robert Whitaker example I just provided, or
Mm-hmm.
you need to have you need to have a point of contact with his management, with his
Yeah.
PR people. So that would be another tip I would give anybody. If you want a big name that is in the UFC, find out who their manager is, find out where that company's contact information is, and contact that company. Good luck to you.
Yeah.
You don't expect anything in return because they have a lot of demands for their time, but I think that's a really important qualifier. A lot of people just don't really think about the totality of the circumstances and just assume Conor McGregor's a DM away, and that's not the case.
Absolutely. Yeah. Messaging the management company has been a good help. Um, It does, yeah. And like you said, this is luck. This A lot of this is just luck, isn't it? It sucks to say because it looks like we're working hard, but if you send enough messages to enough people, someone's gonna luck eventually, right? That's how we got this far.
Yeah, exactly. You have to have a healthy dose of delusion, and you really have to. There has to be some sort of like self motivator, because if you're reliant on clicks, if you're reliant on other people reacting to like the first pieces you put out there,
Yeah.
that reception may not be what it is that you anticipate. So I don't explain it. I think that answer's a little bit different for all of us, but there has to be something like a fire within that keeps you going. Because I tell you what, this is like a very, very difficult place to not only get started, but to stick around. I think we covered a little bit. I think we covered that piece. Tim, I
Yeah.
wanted to shift gears here and ask you a couple questions. What separates a good interview in your mind from a not so great interview? Like we're competing for attention, we're competing for time, we're trying to get audience retention. You do a really great job, I feel, in your interviews. I've watched many of them over the years, and I feel like I'm engaged. I feel like I'm about to learn something. If I watch Tim's segment on a kickboxer or a mixed martial artist, there's going to be a nugget that comes out of here that I'm not going to get anywhere else. Can you tell me, like, I know that's not formulaic. I know there's a science and art to it, but are there some general rules of thumb that other people could follow to try to put out a captivating product?
Okay. So I think I don't want to pat myself on the back too much, but I worked in sales before. Essentially, financial planning was a form of sales. So anytime I picked up the phone or someone sat down in my office, it doesn't matter their age or how much money they have, you better make a connection with that person within 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
So over the decade that I worked in financial planning, I was able to really pick up that like conversational voice, that really like salesman-y voice. And it's not as that is the part that's a little bit harder to teach and a little bit harder to learn. In terms of the actual formula that I do, I think fighters do get tired of talking about their fight sometime because you might be the 10th interview that day. And you're like, so what's the game plan for the next fight? And you're like, no, I'm so sick of talking about my next fight. You know what I mean? Tomorrow they're doing 10 more interviews. What's the game plan for the next fight?
Mm-hmm.
So you have to find something else for them to talk about to loosen them up a little bit. And then what I do, I always have like the same 10 questions just ready to go. What's the plan for the next fight? What do you see in the future? Who do you want next?
Mm-hmm.
I've broken that down to a formula. I always try to find a lot of fighters have Facebooks that they've had since the 7th grade. And I'll go on there to try to find some like secret stuff, some stuff in their past and just ask about like, hey, you listen to this, don't you? You can find stuff on like what was their first follower on Instagram or what was their first follower, what was the first thing that they followed on Instagram. I mean, that might tell you a lot about what they're into, and you can jump off to like, oh, I saw you like Lil Wayne. Let's talk about music a little bit because it's different, it's something special. Try to talk about any video games or anime that they're into, because that stuff, I think, like if someone asked me right now, like, what's your favorite anime? I'm like, yeah, let's talk about that. You know what I mean? That's something different. They're not getting that same question. And like one guy I found like when he was in grade like 10, he liked the Power Rangers. And I was like, okay, I'm going to ask him about Power Rangers. And he was stunned that I knew about that. So honestly, it does take time. Dig deep. Have your basic questions ready to go, but try to find something unique about that person that you can actually ask about and have all you're trying to do in an interview is you're not trying to do an interview. You want to just have a conversation with a human being. That's all you want to do. And any way you can move a conversation from question and answer to a conversation, you've won, right?
Absolutely. I think the it boils down to, ladies and gentlemen, make the effort, put in that effort. The clues are out there. You have to be a digital detective and figure it out. But I promise you, if you make that effort, it's going to come through in your interview. It really will. Um, and it also helps with your confidence, right? Because like sometimes being nervous for an interview, I always think back. I'm like, okay, wait a minute though. Why am I nervous? I've done all my research. I've done everything. I'm prepared. I'm ready to go. And usually, when I think about it in that sense, I'm good to go. And which leads me
Yeah.
to another question, Tim. What's the most nervous you've ever been for an interview?
Ash booked Kayla Harrison one day, and it was one of my first interviews that I've ever had in my life. I've never been more nervous in my life for an interview. That was also very early on in my MMA career. To have one of their first interviews be Kayla Harrison, holy shit.
Right.
What the hell was I doing back then? And then I was like bringing up stuff like, hey, in your book, you talk about getting sexually assaulted. This confidence, what is this? And then it turned out to be one of the best interviews I've ever done. And even to this day, that's one of the best interviews. But yeah, Kayla Harrison, I was very lucky to have her on the show. She does not return your messages now, does not return my messages now. That's just the way this story goes sometimes. Like we talked on and off for a while, and then that was the end of that. And that's pretty typical of MMA fighters as they increase in how famous they are, I find. But yeah, Kayla was my most nervous. Who was your most nervous?
I would say either Randy Couture or Anthony
Yeah.
Smith. Both of those were pretty maybe from a nerves perspective, probably Anthony Smith, because I had no idea what the hell I was doing. Very,
Yeah.
very similar. And I will say I leave that interview up there because for me anyway, it like served more of a fanboy itch than anything.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
I don't know if I would call that like a solid piece of like good journalism. It
Mhm.
wasn't. I was just getting started. I
I get
booked
that.
him through a very gimmicky process, and I just humored him. And it was a fanboy piece. It really was. But I leave it up there because it reminds me of how far I've come. Like you look at that and you're like, oh man, this guy's just fanboying over Anthony Smith, and I don't dispute any of that. That's 100% true.
No.
Um,
Yeah.
but I look at it and I'm just like, I'm gonna leave that up there though because it's like I'm going to need to work on some things if I want to like be in this space over a long period of time.
Yeah.
That's a blueprint for a lot of things on maybe what you shouldn't do. It's fine if you're like you make it known like, hey,
No.
like I'm a huge admirer of this guy. I'm a big fan. I'm going to interview him, and the piece is good because that authenticity shines through. Right, I'm not
Right.
Ariel Hawaning this guy. Like I'm just like it's a conversation between a fan and a fighter. That's it. And I leave it up there because it's like I think that's important though, because it's
Mhm.
like regardless of like how much I may be into a fighter, there are certain things I probably shouldn't say and questions I shouldn't ask. Because we're trying to, the goal at the end of the day is to be objective. So I learned a lot about that, but I was definitely nervous as hell going into it. Like you get the sweaty palms thing, you're shaking a little bit,
Oh yeah.
kind of like,
Oh my God.
fuck me. Like the reality of what's about to happen is like, and you're just sitting there in suspense, like, holy shit, like we are supposed to do this 5 minutes ago. Like, are they still gonna show up? Am I ready? Like, do I look good? Is my neighbor gonna start chopping down a tree? What the fuck is
Yeah.
happening? Like that anxiety is real, man. It really is.
But yeah, Anthony Smith, I feel like would have been a good one because like, he's a talker. He's a professional talker. Randy's really tough because he's a legend. He's also like a 65-year-old man. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right. And for that one, it was definitely tough because like you're on a shot clock. That's a very important thing for
Yeah.
people to understand. Like if you book a interview through a management or promotion, there's typically an understanding like you have 15 minutes and you don't have one
Yeah.
second over 15 minutes. So you
Yeah.
better like ask your questions and be ready to go. I got
Yeah.
Randy out of there in like 12 minutes. And I was really happy because I was like, you know what? Bam, these are my questions, and I'm not going to risk going over because I don't want to piss off anybody else. So we're going to call it at 12 minutes. And I was really proud of myself for having that discipline to do that because, it's Randy fucking Couture on the other end. And of course, you want chat about, him fighting Brock Lesnar and all other kinds of stuff. And you can't.
And that's the thing. Now, booking through that way, you do there is it's almost unspoken, but you know it's there of like you book through a company, you have to sell what that company was selling. Sometimes it's booked through a gambling site, sometimes it's booked through a management company, but you also know of like, hey, you fought Brock and now you're selling chairs or something. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Yeah, so let's talk about chairs. Like, what chair would you hit Brock with? Like, that's
Yeah.
how it works, right? Like,
Yeah.
so you have to remember. That's a very good point. You have to remember, like, how did you get this lined up? Um,
Yeah.
you're either most of the time, if you're getting somebody like that, like they're there to promote something. So
Yes.
remember what
Yes.
that is. Hopefully, you know that answer. Tim, I'd be remiss if
You know what? I'll tell you one because it was my book through Stake, the huge gambling website. They just messaged like, "Do you want this fighter?" Well, yeah, sounds good. And then we talked for like 15 minutes, or I think it was 12 minutes, and I was like, "Hey, tell me about Stake." And this fighter was like, "What's Stake?" And I was like, "You have to know." You have
So it's like,
to-
okay, like this is where my editing chops are going to come in. Like, let's go on Google real quick. I'll tell you a little bit about them, and then we'll.
Let me tell you about it, and then you read it back to me because that's why we're here. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you. Please go ahead.
I was just going to simply stay like, I'd be remiss to, before we conclude, I'd be remiss to not talk to you about the sport that we cover, which is
Yeah.
MMA. I think there are a couple storylines here, and I'm going to get right into the big one.
Mm.
There's a lot of smoke. You've read it all over the internet for the past week about Bellator potentially being for sale. There's presumably as of today is April 30th, 2023, and it's important to timestamp this conversation. There are rumors that Bellator is for sale. There are rumors that PFL is potentially interested in acquiring the Bellator brand. This was first reported by Ariel Helwani about 5 months ago, but and people kind of forgot about that. And now all of a sudden, this zombie of a conversation has come up. I posted a little bit about it. I got a lot of messages my way from fighters expressing a lot of enthusiasm. I heard a couple people tell me that I'm fake news and it'll never happen. And then I heard a bunch of other people tell me like, "Oh my God, it's happening. When is it gonna take place?" And my answer was, number one, make sure you read my post in full. Number one, and then come back to me. But that's a Tyler complaint for another day. Tim, your take on this big news? There's a lot of moving parts here. I guess the first question is: were you surprised when you found out that Bellator was making themselves available for purchase?
No, I know. I think that's par for the course for Scott Coker run industries. Of like, he is very good at running an organization that makes money. That's the scary part about Strikeforce, is that no one in this space, from Elite XC to like even Pride and K1, they weren't making that much money at the time. But Scott Coker can run a company profitable, like, and he knows his limits and stuff like that. That's why some fighters just like barely ever fight. But he can run a profitable company and set it up so that it can be sold to somebody else in the future, and they can make a lot of money doing that way. Was I surprised? No, absolutely not. Was I surprised to hear that it was the PFL? Yeah, I guess so. That's kind of weird. Like, one of the talented things that PFL can do is raise capital, because I'm not sure that company runs profitable, or they just like run at a loss and then they have big name investors just injecting
I believe
money.
it's the latter.
Yes. Yeah, we know. We're a bit too inside, but this was reported originally by Todd Atkins, and it's the gentleman I've worked with before. Yeah, I guess so. I think Bellator really wanted to sell to Zuffa like they did with, sorry, not Zuffa, WME, because they sold originally to the UFC with their Strikeforce deal 10 years ago, and I think that's what they wanted to do again. And I think the UFC just doesn't care about those things at the moment, because they're vertical growth, but that is a step backwards for them. Yeah, I wouldn't be overly surprised, because it kind of makes sense. For this space, you do need to corner the market for companies like this, because if you are a Bellator or PFL, you need to be targeting, you are an 18 to 24 is your demographic. And if you're splitting, there's the UFC who owns that demographic, especially now with the WWE, they own that demographic. You're fighting for pennies over here. You can't be fighting with the PFL and Bellator in the US space. You need to target that demographic as much as possible. And a buyout or a merger, yeah, that makes sense. I can see that, absolutely. What do you think of it, though? What do you make? Oh, also, another thing. I went on Twitter to talk to insiders about this. One insider said, no, this is not happening. Another insider said, yes, this is absolutely happening. So nobody knows. No one has any clue what's going on. What are your thoughts on it, man?
It's a very interesting conversation to have. And first and foremost, I would preface this by saying, and you've alluded to this, Tim, in some of your work, and I completely agreed with you. You questioned, this is about 12 to 18 months ago.
Right.
You put out a piece out there. I wish I could find it. You put out a piece out there that questioning, like, is Bellator the like true, like, in the North American Europe market, is it really like the number two? Yeah, and you're like, there's like some sporadic cards. The volume isn't quite there. You talked a little bit about the whole ONE FC dynamic, and then PFL, and then the Challenger Series coming up, and that got me thinking. I was like, yeah, that is very interesting, because the PFL Challenger Series is coming up, and to feed that whole tournament, what are they doing? They're grabbing the best talent in Europe, in Canada, in North America, in South America. I'm like, these are things that Bellator should be doing. That to
Bellator
me,
did a go on.
It was just an indicator to me. I'm like, okay, well, I know that Bellator, they have a presence in Ireland, and it's kind of hit or miss though. Like, I feel like they return to that well every 90 days, every 120 days. Is that enough to sustain interest in the European market over a sustained period of time? And these are questions I really had, and I'm like, that doesn't really make sense. And then, meanwhile, PFL's signing in and bringing in all this talent. There's this $1 million title prize that they've marketed very well. Every fighter whether they're an amateur or whether they fight in Scotland or whatever. Everyone knows that, hey, PFL, like it's synonymous with $1 million. I think that they've branded and marketed really well, and they've acquired a ton of talent. I always thought to myself shortly after your piece, I was like, yeah, Tim's right. I would say for the excluding one, because that's a very different kind of mixed bag. Excluding one, when you take them out of the picture, I think they're the clear number two.
Yeah, Bellator or PFL, you're saying?
PFL being the number two.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely correct. I agree with you on this because both companies were trying to find like spaces where the UFC is not. And that was Hawaii, that was Ireland, that was the UK, that was parts of Europe that were really hungry for MMA and not getting it. The UFC like hasn't been to Ireland in like a decade. The
Right.
UFC went to the UK twice last year because they hadn't been in 5 years or something like that. They've never gone to Hawaii, so they're finding these areas. Bellator was still first in Paris and stuff like that, and then or PFL will be functioning there in the next few years. They do a show in the UK all the time, but I think you're right because the PFL, sorry, this game is all about creating storylines, and it really is about buying into it. And the PFL model lends itself really well to storylines of this person who's a scrappy young fighter, up and comer. They're fighting for $1 million because they're fighting for their family. There's always some storyline attached with these people. And that's amazing. Kayla Harrison winning, Kayla Harrison losing. Those are big moments. And Bellator just hasn't had that story that really stuck with anyone in such a long time. Like Patchy Mix was pretty close to that.
Sure.
And then Fedor retiring was another like, oh, you made a moment here. You made a moment that I'm never going to forget. That's really cool. Patchy Mix I'll never forget. But you guys don't have these moments nearly often enough of like it's industry insiders that we talk with who are like, oh yeah, I forgot Bellator was doing anything right now. You know what I mean? So I think the PFL absolutely is number two. I agree with you wholeheartedly.
I think one of the more interesting things about the Bellator dynamic is like 99% of the time, I feel like the undercard's always more entertaining than the main card. And
It
the reason
is
why is
100%.
because they're grabbing guys, they're grabbing local fighters, and then typically it's these David versus Goliath fights between these local pros that they've called up and then their protected A side. And every once in a while, Tim Wheaton, one of those fights don't go according to plan, and it makes a real magical moment. A great example of that was Ben Parrish fighting Christian Edwards. He ends up knocking him out, and that made headlines all over the world. And occasionally you'll get a rare thing like that, but then we forget about what happened in the fights following. And I'm like, that's kind of I don't know if I'd like that if I was like a Bellator suit.
I agree with you. You got to find those storylines leading into each event and then really drill in those storylines with everyone in the media so we don't forget. Like, you don't want them just being like, oh, Bellator is having another show. That should never be the take. PFL never has that. We're never having another PFL show. It's always like, wow, these people are fighting for this in the end. This person's fighting for their family. It's a matter of creating storylines in this sport.
Were you concerned at all, like when you look at like the talent that Bellator has been bringing in? I look at it and I'm like, okay, well, they're bringing in a lot of like American wrestlers with no real MMA experience. That's what I see. And then I've also seen them like bring in people that maybe are on like the back nine of their career, following a UFC stint. And it's always interesting because I felt like, 3 or 4 years ago, Bellator was making like a really like line in the sand. Like they were trying to buck that stereotype that they were looking for UFC fighters that are long in the tooth. And then they brought in some talent that, are ex UFC cast offs. And I'm like, that kind of goes against everything you guys have been trying to like buck. You've been trying to buck that trend for the past 3 or 4 years. Now you're going back to that well. So, like from an acquisition, from a talent acquisition standpoint, I have some concern about what it is that they're doing. It's not exactly the most coherent path in my mind.
So I read Ken Shamrock's book, and he fought for Scott Coker. He kind of fought with Scott Coker for one of their like Bellator versus Hoist Gracie events, which was like no one wanted that,
right?
But Scott Coker is under no delusions that he needs to put ex UFC fighters on it to bring up, and then we can promote our Michael Venom pages and stuff like that. Like, and you and I talk about it of like, if we're talking about Bellator talent, we'll probably talk about Lyoto Machida and Yoel Romero before we talk about their Patchy Mixes or their Darian Caldwells or something like that. So Scott Coker absolutely is well aware of like, we need these X names. Like, one of the most embarrassing things is like, you guys should be making your own talent, but the number one rated MMA event in history was Kimbo Slice versus Ken Shamrock. You know what I mean? Of like, okay, you can build your talent and make no money, or you can sign an ex-UFC fighter and get some ratings on TV. And it's just the reality of the sport that we're going to tune in for Royce Gracie versus Ken Shamrock 19 before we tune into another Darian called. Like Bellator versus Ryzen was really cool. That had a lot of good storylines coming out. It still didn't break Kimbo Slice Tank Habit in terms
Right.
of ratings, and that sucks.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask you a little bit is I can understand from the Bellator standpoint, like selling, lining your pockets, and then just kind of moving on to something a
Yeah.
little bit different. But if you're from the PFL side of the table, what do you gain from acquiring Bellator?
Yeah, I think they have a pretty good agreement with Showtime, and there's really entrenched with Showtime and maybe CBS to a lesser extent. But yeah, it's a matter of absorbing that demographic so that when you speak to something like someone who wants to market in the male 18 to 34 demographic, um, you can do a lot better if you're like, hey, I'm doing X amount of viewers per week, and there's no other options. Because right now, I feel like a sponsor, if you're talking to the PFL and they're asking for too much money, you can just go, oh, I'll talk to Bellator. Okay,
Mhm.
that's fine. But if you're owning that space a little more, yeah, it's going to be better sponsorship opportunities for them. And yeah, I don't know if it's actually going to help viewership numbers or something like that. Because if you're not watching PFL or Bellator now, when they're merged, I don't think you're going to be more convinced to watch it. I do feel like it's a more behind the scenes thing of like, we have better TV deals and we have better sponsorships for this. What do you think though?
Yeah, it's really interesting to me. I do feel from the PFL standpoint, one of the more compelling business cases for acquiring it is just simple market share.
Yeah.
There is like a little dedicated hardcore base of Bellator people that you would just acquire.
Yeah.
The other good part about it is think about like when the Bellator Ryzen thing, right? It was
Yeah,
great
that was awesome.
marketing
It's great.
because from the Bellator standpoint is like if these fights go how we think they're going to go,
And
that
they
is going
did.
to help give our brand more clout. Like it's going to show like, hey, no, our guys are better than your guys. Like our guys are going to beat the crap out of your guys. And it's going to be like almost like self-validating in a way. For
Yeah.
PFL, it's like, okay, I'm looking at your talent, I'm looking at your rankings. I'm going to go ahead, I'll take your brand, and I'm going to take your number 3 female featherweight, and I'm going to put them against one of my new signees from the Challenger series, and let's see what happens. Right. And that makes for a compelling story. You're going to want to
Yes.
tune in. The Bellator people
Yes.
are going to be like, oh no, this person has so much more experience. No, they're going to beat this new hot shot. Whereas you're going to have that, young high school kid from PFL going like, oh, like I know this chick. I've seen her fight before. And bam, now we have storylines that are happening.
Yeah.
And I think that's compelling television. So
I agree with you.
for
I
for,
agree with you.
for Bellator, the way I see it is like I think with their current construct, Bellator's hard to watch. At least in America, it is,
It is.
right? Because it's like they're streaming the undercard on YouTube, and then the main card is behind a Showtime paywall in North America. I know it's different for you guys. So I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, well, if you want that North American market, you're making it difficult for people to watch because in
Yes.
America and in Canada we watch TSN and we watch ESPN. Like those are like the big like go-to places people go for their MMA content. And if you're not on either of those platforms in the North American market, you're behind. Like you need TSN and you need
Yeah.
ESPN.
It needs to be accessible, right? Making it less accessible really doesn't make sense. And like Bellator has that problem in the UK, but the UFC also majorly has that problem in the UK as well. Of like, you want to grow into a new market, why is it behind a paywall? If you want to grow in a market, it needs to be accessible to those viewers right now, anytime they want to have it. And I think one of the reasons we got into the UFC originally was because of just how much Spike TV was like one of the main channels on cable TV, and they replayed like BJ Penn and Chuck Liddell highlight clips all fucking day long.
Right.
And like Bellator in the UK, you're on at 5 in the morning. The UFC, you're on at 5 in the morning behind a paywall. You're not getting fans with this. You know what I mean? You have to be accessible. You have to be on the TSN during primetime hours, right?
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I've tried to explain why pay-per-views are not pay-per-views in the UK. I'm like, well, you have to look at it. People aren't going to spend 100 pounds or 70 pounds, I guess, to watch a card
Yeah,
at 4 in the morning. Like some Tim Wheatons will, but like other people
sure.
won't. Like normal people won't do that. It has to be free. That's the only way you're going to be able to like get eyeballs on the screen.
Yeah, 100%. I know. I
Tim,
agree with
I
you.
really appreciate your time. I know I've kept you a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I wanted to give you the final word. If there's anyone that you would like to thank, or if there's any publication that you're working with, or any story that you're about to put out that you are able to trailer or talk about a little bit, I'd love for you to have that opportunity before I let you go.
Well, thank you to Tyler. Massive thank you, Mr. Mom's Basement MMA. Huge thank you for putting this out. You are the one and only Mom's Basement MMA in my eyes.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's a
Uh,
subject of debate too. You know exactly what I'm saying.
I do. I do. Every once in a while it pops up and I'm like, what's Tyler doing? Why is Tyler in trouble? Oh, it's some other dork.
Yeah, some other. Yeah, yeah. I invited him to be on my show too. By the way, he left me
And
on red though.
yeah. That's
Yeah,
fine.
you know, too cool for me, I guess. We'll have a basement off later.
Thank you. Like originally, if we're doing like this feels like an award for me. So to be on this show. So thank you very much. So thank you to all the websites who took a risk on me initially. Thank you to all the organizations who gave me full access at some points. Thank you to my wife. She's the best. Thank you to Ash for helping out, building this as much as possible. He gets as much credit in my success as I do. I'm sure there's lots of other people I'm forgetting. Thank you to James Lynch for making those early videos to really like how to get in this industry. But yeah, Tyler, thank you so much for your time, sir. Oh, I have a piece coming out on the fight site later this week as well. I like the fight site because their readers are very dedicated. You put stuff out on websites, you never know if someone's reading it. You put it on the fight site, you get people disagreeing, so people are reading it. But yeah, I got a big piece about Yuki Kondo coming out this week. Yuki Kondo, one of the original bad boys, fought in Pride, fought in the UFC, he was one of the founders of Pancrase along with a few other people. So I wrote a big piece on him. But yeah, check that out on the fight site. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
And one sneaky question for you, super quick, without qualifying it: Cejudo versus Sterling. Who do you got?
I'll take Cejudo on that one. But here's the qualifiers. Like, I don't know what kind of shape this guy is in. It's been 3 years since he fought last. But in terms of grappling and striking, his karate boxing should be better on the feet, and his grappling should absolutely be better than Sterling. But again, I don't know what kind of shape he is in. 3 years in this game, those are decades. Like, this guy is a geriatric, right? What's your thoughts on it?
No, I'm going with Thane still. I just
Yep.
can't. I can't for some of those reasons for the time away.
Yeah.
Any every year you're away from MMA is a light year, and
Yeah.
I'm very very curious to see how that's going to translate. A lot of times when there's a gap, these guys just don't look the same. I
I
think
know.
we're thinking about 2017, 2018 in our mind, and hey, 2017, 2018, that was a minute ago. It's 2023. I'm gonna go with Thane still.
I agree. Yeah, I can see it absolutely. Oh, Aljo is so good. I love his like takedown to back take that he does. Holy shit, it's so good. It's like Sakuraba-esque, like what he used to do. And he's also very big for that weight class. Like Cejudo, keep in mind that he's only had one fight at 135. And like, yeah, you did well enough in it. But Sterling's very big for 135,
So
right?
I met Aljo at an event. I met him.
He's big. He's bigger than
I
Matt Serra was
I
at
will tell
170.
you. So just to like put it out, put the disclaimer out there. I am about 5'9",
Yeah, okay.
um, which is pretty normal size.
That
So
is.
when I think about a bantamweight, I'm like, okay, like in my mind, I have an idea of like what a bantamweight ought to look like.
Yeah.
I met him, and he is just slightly shorter than me, slightly. Um, and when I looked at him, I'm like, this guy is probably 180 pounds. Like,
Yeah.
this was outside of fight camp or whatnot, and he was just getting ready to fight TJ Dillashaw.
Yes.
He's huge. Like, he is a big dude. Like, I would say he was about 180 pounds, and you could tell he was an athlete. You could tell he was pretty yoked up. He had a couple beers in hand too, but in any event, yeah, I was very surprised at how big he was. Very big.
Yeah, man, yeah. So like you said, and then Cejudo was 125 average size for 125. Now he's going up against 135 and a big 135er.
We'll see.
I don't
I
know.
don't
I
know.
don't know.
I don't
But
know
yeah,
about that. But Tim, anyway, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for being here. And I look forward to having you back very, very soon.
anytime, Tyler. I got your back. Hey, have a great week. We'll talk to you soon, man.